Picture this. You're standing at the altar in the most beautiful dress you've ever worn, the music is swelling, every eye in the room is on you, and the entire row reserved for your family is completely empty. Not one seat filled. Not one face you grew up with. Can you imagine that feeling? That specific hollow silence where your mother's smile should be, where your father's proud nod should be, where your sister's tears of joy should be. My name is Sophia. I was 28 years old on the day I got married, and I want to tell you exactly how my family chose my younger sister's engagement party over my wedding, and how, 3 weeks later, my mother's phone call would change everything forever. But to understand how I ended up standing alone at that altar, you need to understand something first. You need to understand what it's like to grow up as the daughter nobody notices. Stay with me because this story isn't just about a wedding. It's about what happens when the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally show you, in the clearest way possible, exactly where you rank. And it's about what happens when the universe, or in my case, a very specific, very deliberate woman named my grandmother, decides that enough is enough. Let's start at the beginning. I was born first. For about 18 months, I was an only child, and from what my father used to tell me before things changed between us, I was adored. Photographs of me covered the walls of our small house in those early years: Sophia in a sun hat, Sophia's first steps, Sophia asleep in my mother's arms with the golden hour light catching her face. Then Isabella was born, and something in our family shifted so completely that it was like watching a plant slowly turn away from one window and toward another, chasing a different, brighter light. Isabella was, by any objective measure, an easy child to love loudly. She had my mother's exact laugh, an infectious, tinkling sound that made strangers in grocery stores turn and smile. She was naturally graceful, athletic, the kind of little girl who could walk into a dance recital and simply glow under the stage lights while the rest of us sat in folding chairs, clapping. She had an ease with people that I never had. Where I was quiet, watchful, more comfortable with a book than a crowd, Isabella filled every room she walked into. I don't say any of this with bitterness toward her, not really, not anymore. Isabella didn't ask to be the son our family orbited, but our parents made a choice over and over again, year after year, about where to point their attention, and they chose her. Every time. I remember being 9 years old and bringing home a report card with straight A's, walking into the kitchen with it held against my chest like a shield, waiting for my mother to look up from the stove. She glanced at it for maybe 4 seconds. "That's wonderful, sweetheart," she said, already turning back to the pot in front of her. 10 minutes later, Isabella walked in from her ballet class, and my mother dropped the wooden spoon entirely to kneel down and ask her, breathlessly, how it went, like Isabella had just returned from Antarctica instead of a dance studio 3 blocks away. Can you imagine sitting at your own dinner table, watching your parents' faces light up for someone else's small victories while your own accomplishments got a polite nod and nothing more? That was my childhood, in 1,000 small moments that individually meant nothing, but together built an entire architecture of feeling invisible in my own home. My father was quieter in his favoritism, but it was there too, in the way he came to every single one of Isabella's soccer games but somehow always had a work thing during my debate tournaments. In the way he introduced Isabella to his colleagues as my daughter, the star, while I was simply my other daughter, Sophia. There's a particular kind of loneliness that comes from being surrounded by your own family and still feeling like a stranger in the house. I used to lie in bed at night and wonder what was wrong with me, what invisible flaw I carried that made me so easy to overlook. I wasn't unloved, exactly. My parents would have been offended if you'd suggested that to their faces. But love, when it's rationed out unevenly for 2 decades, starts to feel like something you have to earn rather than something you simply deserve. The one person who ever seemed to truly see me, who understood exactly what I was worth without needing me to prove anything, was my grandmother, Eleanor, my mother's mother. Grandma Eleanor was sharp as a tack well into her 80s, a former accountant who had built a modest but respectable fortune through decades of careful, unglamorous discipline. She never had much patience for favoritism, and she always noticed, the way my parents treated Isabella and me differently. "You have more sense in your little finger than that sister of yours has in her whole body, and don't you ever let anyone convince you otherwise," she told me once. When I was 17 and crying in her kitchen after my parents had missed my high school graduation ceremony because Isabella had a can't-miss cheerleading competition that same weekend. Grandma Eleanor had been the only family member in the audience that day, sitting ramrod straight in the third row, clapping so hard for me that people around her must have thought I was the valedictorian of 10 schools combined. She used to tell me in that dry, matter-of-fact way of hers, being overlooked isn't the same as being unworthy, Sophia. Sometimes it just means the people around you don't have the eyes to see what's right in front of them. But someday, someone will, and when they do, you'll understand what you were worth all along. I didn't know back then just how prophetic those words would turn out to be, in more ways than one. Looking back now, I can see how those years shaped the woman I eventually became. Careful, self-reliant, a little too quick to assume I had to earn my place in any room I walked into. I became the kind of person who overprepared for job interviews because I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd have to be twice as impressive as anyone else simply to be noticed. I became the kind of friend who showed up early and stayed late, who remembered birthdays and anniversaries and small details other people forgot, because some part of me was still trying to prove, to an audience that had long since stopped watching, that I was worth remembering. There's a strange kind of grief in realizing, as an adult, that the coping mechanisms you developed as a lonely child are still quietly running your life decades later. I didn't fully understand, until I was well into my 20s, just how much of my personality had been built as a kind of armor, competence as a substitute for belonging, independence as a substitute for being chosen. I want to say that clearly because I think a lot of people watching this know exactly what I mean. When you grow up as the overlooked one, you don't just carry sadness. You carry a whole architecture of survival strategies, built quietly, brick by brick, without anyone ever teaching you how to lay them down once you don't need them anymore. Grandma Eleanor was the only person who ever seemed to notice the cost of that architecture. She used to invite me to her house every other Sunday, just the two of us, and we'd sit at her kitchen table drinking tea while she asked me real questions, not how was school, the polite deflection my parents offered, but what have you been thinking about lately, Sophia? What's actually on your mind? Nobody else in my life asked questions like that. Nobody else seemed to genuinely want the answer. I met Alexander when I was 26, at a mutual friend's dinner party that I'd almost skipped because I was tired and, frankly, a little sick of watching happy couples across candlelit tables while I sat there single again. I'm glad I went anyway. Alexander was an architect, methodical and warm in a way that immediately put me at ease. What struck me first wasn't his obvious charm, though he had plenty of it, but the way he listened. Really listened, the way you listen when you actually care what someone has to say, not the way you listen while waiting for your turn to talk. On our third date, I told him almost as a joke about growing up in Isabella's shadow, expecting him to laugh it off or change the subject the way most people did when family drama got too heavy for a casual dinner. Instead, he set down his fork, looked at me steadily and said, "That sounds incredibly lonely. I'm sorry you grew up feeling like you had to compete for love that should have just been given to you." Nobody had ever put it into words like that before. Not even I had put it into words like that before. I remember excusing myself to the restroom just so I could cry for 30 seconds in private before coming back to finish my pasta like a normal, composed adult. Over the next 2 years, Alexander became the steadiest, safest thing in my life. His parents, Margaret and David, folded me into their family with an ease that still sometimes brought tears to my eyes. Margaret called me her girl within 6 months of meeting me. David taught me how to grill the perfect steak on their back patio, patiently, the way I imagined a father was supposed to teach these things. At their Sunday dinners, I was asked about my work, my opinions, my day, not as an afterthought, but as a matter of course, the way you naturally ask anyone you loved. It was healing, in ways I didn't fully understand until years later. Alexander's family showed me what it looked like to be a full, valued member of a household instead of a supporting character in someone else's story. When Alexander got down on one knee on a hiking trail overlooking the city we'd fallen in love in and asked me to marry him, I said yes before he'd even finished the question. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe that maybe, just maybe, my own family would finally show up for me the way they'd always shown up for Isabella. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. We set the date almost immediately. A Saturday in early June, exactly 14 months out, chosen deliberately because it gave us plenty of time to plan, and because it fell on my parents' wedding anniversary, which felt like a sweet, sentimental touch when Alexander suggested it. I called my mother the day we picked the date, practically vibrating with excitement. "Mom, we picked June 14th. Isn't that perfect? It's your anniversary, too." There was a pause on the line, the kind of pause I'd learned over 28 years to recognize as a bad sign. "Oh, that's nice, honey," she said, in a tone that suggested she was reading something else at the same time. "We'll have to check the calendar, but I'm sure it'll work out." I brushed off the coolness in her voice. I told myself I was imagining it, that this was my wedding, and surely, that would matter enough to override whatever chronic distraction had always kept my parents one step removed from my life. For the next year, I planned every detail of that wedding with the kind of devotion usually reserved for a second full-time job. I found a venue, a converted vineyard barn about 45 minutes outside the city, with exposed wooden beams and floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over rolling hills of grapevines. I chose a dress that made me cry the first time I put it on, a fitted ivory gown with delicate lace sleeves that Margaret, Alexander's mother, insisted on paying for as her gift to her future daughter. I sent save the dates 11 months in advance. I sent formal invitations 8 months in advance, with my parents' and Isabella's names at the very top of the guest list. Naturally, because despite everything, despite the years of feeling secondary in my own family, I still wanted them there. I still hoped, somewhere in the stubborn, hopeful part of my heart, that this, my wedding, arguably the most significant day of my adult life, would finally be the moment they showed up for me completely. I asked Isabella to be a bridesmaid. She said yes, though I noticed, even then, a strange flatness in her enthusiasm that I chose to ignore. Every phone call with my mother in those months followed the same pattern. I would share some new wedding detail, the flowers, the menu, the string quartet we'd booked, and she would offer a distracted, half-present response before pivoting, almost every single time, to something happening in Isabella's life. Isabella had gotten a promotion. Isabella was dating someone new. Isabella was thinking about buying a condo. I began to notice that I was spending most of my phone calls with my own mother talking about my sister. I told myself it didn't matter. I had Alexander. I had his family, who treated my wedding planning like the most exciting event of the year, who asked about seating charts and cake flavors with genuine enthusiasm. I told myself that was enough. I remember one particular evening, about 6 months into planning, sitting on the floor of my apartment surrounded by fabric swatches and seating chart drafts, calling my mother just to share how excited I was about the floral arrangements I'd finally settled on: soft garden roses in blush and cream, with sprigs of rosemary tucked in for fragrance, a detail I'd spent weeks agonizing over. My mother listened for perhaps 90 seconds before asking if I'd heard that Isabella was up for another promotion at work. I hung up that call and sat there for a long moment, staring at the swatches scattered across my carpet, feeling that old familiar hollowness settle back into my chest, the one I thought I'd mostly outgrown. Alexander noticed those calls taking something out of me, even when I tried to hide it. "You don't have to keep hoping this time will be different," he told me gently one night, after I'd hung up from another conversation that had somehow drifted, once again, toward my sister. "But if some part of you does keep hoping, that's okay too. I just don't want you carrying that hope alone." I loved him fiercely for saying that, for naming the exact quiet ache I hadn't fully admitted even to myself. Then 4 months before my wedding, Isabella got engaged. Her boyfriend, Daniel, a perfectly pleasant, unremarkable man she'd been dating for about a year and a half, proposed at a rooftop restaurant downtown, complete with a string quartet he'd hired specifically for the occasion and a photographer who captured the whole thing for what would become an extensively documented social media rollout. I was genuinely happy for her. I called her the morning after to congratulate her, and I meant every word of it. "We're thinking about having the engagement party pretty soon," Isabella told me over the phone, her voice bright and breathless with excitement. "Mom wants to do something big, you know how she gets." I did know how she got. I'd watched my mother pour more enthusiasm into planning a single dinner party for Isabella's college graduation than she'd shown for my entire wedding thus far, but I pushed that uncharitable thought down and told Isabella I couldn't wait to celebrate with her. 3 weeks later, I got a text from my mother with an attached digital invitation. Isabella's engagement party, save the date. June 14th. The exact date of my wedding. I stared at my phone for a full minute, genuinely convinced I was misreading it, that some kind of formatting error had scrambled the numbers. I called my mother immediately, my heart pounding in a way that felt disproportionate even to me, before I understood exactly how disproportionate it should have felt. Mom, the invitation for Isabella's party says June 14th. That's my wedding day. Oh, is it? My mother said, and there was something in her voice, not shock, not the scrambling apology I expected, but something closer to mild inconvenience, like I'd pointed out a minor scheduling conflict at the dentist's office. Well, we didn't realize the dates overlapped exactly. Let me talk to Isabella. She called me back 2 hours later, so we looked into it and it turns out the venue Isabella wants is only available that specific Saturday for the next 4 months. She's had her heart set on the Baymont Terrace, the one with the view of the harbor, and they had exactly one opening before the fall. We really don't think it's a big deal, Sophia. You'll have your wedding, she'll have her party, everyone gets their day. Everyone gets their day. Except we both knew, even as she said it, that when a party and a wedding fall on the exact same day, at the exact same time, in the exact same city, a family has to choose. And I had a sinking, gut-deep feeling about which one they were going to choose. I want you to understand something here. This wasn't an honest scheduling error. My wedding date had been public knowledge, printed on Save the Dates for 11 months before Isabella's engagement even happened. There is no reasonable universe in which a family, planning a party for a newly engaged daughter, doesn't first check the calendar against an already scheduled wedding for their other daughter. My mother had helped me pick out invitation fonts. She had, at minimum, 3 separate conversations with me about my wedding date over the preceding year. This was not an accident. Whether it was Isabella's doing or my mother's eagerness to give her golden child exactly what she wanted regardless of consequences, I'll never know for certain. But I know this, nobody in that family, when faced with the conflict, seriously considered changing the party date. The conversation was never, how do we fix this? It was, from the very first phone call, how do we get you to accept this? I want you to sit with that distinction for a moment, because I think it's the heart of what made this so painful. It wasn't simply a scheduling conflict. It was the quiet, unspoken certainty on my family's part that I would bend, that I always had. That 28 years of accepting less had trained everyone around me to believe I'd accept it again, one more time, without ever truly pushing back. I spent the next several weeks in a strange, suspended state of disbelief, cycling between hoping this would resolve itself and the slow, sinking dread that it wouldn't. I called my mother again, calmer this time, more measured, because I told myself that maybe my initial reaction had come across as unreasonable, that if I simply explained clearly enough, she would understand. Mom, please, can you talk to Isabella about moving the party? Even by a week, I've had this date locked in for over a year. The invitations already went out. Sophia, honestly, I think you're being a little dramatic about this, my mother said, and I remember the exact chill that ran through me at that phrase, at how easily she reached for it, like she'd used it on me 100 times before, because she had. It's one party. It's not like we're choosing sides. You'll get married either way. Isabella just found this venue, and honestly, it took her forever to find something like it. I don't think it's fair to ask her to give that up. It's not fair to ask her to give up a venue, I said, my voice shaking now, but it is fair to ask me to have an empty family section at my wedding. Nobody said that would happen, my mother said, sounding genuinely irritated now, like I was the one being unreasonable. We'll figure something out. Maybe we can split the time, come to part of your ceremony and part of Isabella's party. I asked my father to intervene. I called him directly, something I rarely did, because conversations with my father tended to be brief, practical, and emotionally sparse. Dad, I need your help. Can you talk to Mom about the wedding date, about Isabella's party? There was a long pause, and then he said, in the careful, conflict-averse voice I'd heard him use my entire childhood whenever he didn't want to pick a side, Sophia, you know how your mother gets when it comes to these things. I think it's best if you two work it out between yourselves. I don't want to get in the middle. He never wanted to get in the middle. Not once in 28 years had my father ever gotten in the middle to advocate for me. I tried Isabella directly one final time 3 months before the wedding. I called her, and I didn't hide the desperation in my voice anymore. Izzy, please, this is my wedding. I've been planning it for over a year. Can we please just move your party by even a week? There was a long silence on the line, and when she finally spoke, her voice had an edge to it I hadn't fully heard before, something almost triumphant beneath the practiced sympathy. Sophia, I get that you're upset, but this is my engagement. My one engagement party. I don't get to do this again. You're the one who gets married. That's the actual main event. My party is just like one night. I don't understand why you're making this such a huge thing. Because it's the same night as my wedding, I said, my voice cracking. Do you understand that Mom and Dad might not come to my wedding because of this? That's not my fault, Isabella said. That's between you and them. I hung up the phone that night and sat on my bathroom floor for almost an hour, staring at the tile, feeling something inside me that had been slowly cracking for 28 years finally, quietly break in two. Can you imagine begging your own family repeatedly over months, simply to be prioritized once, just once in your entire life? And can you imagine the specific, targeted cruelty of watching them refuse, not out of malice exactly, but out of the simple, casual assumption that your needs would always naturally come second? 6 weeks before the wedding, I drove to my parents' house for what I told myself walking up the front path would be the last conversation I'd have on this subject. I needed clarity. I needed to know definitively whether they were coming to my wedding. My mother was in the kitchen when I arrived, and something about the domestic normalcy of the scene, the smell of coffee, the radio playing softly, the everyday hum of a house that had never quite felt like it belonged to me, made the conversation that followed even more surreal. Mom, I need to know, are you and Dad coming to my wedding? She didn't even look up from the cutting board where she was slicing vegetables. Sophia, we already told you we're going to try to make it to part of it. We'll come to the ceremony if we can, and then head over to Isabella's party for the reception portion. The ceremony is at 4. Isabella's party starts at 5 at a venue 40 minutes away from my venue. There's no version of making it to part of it that actually works logistically, Mom. You know that. She set down the knife then, finally looking at me, and something in her expression shifted, not into apology, but into something closer to weary defensiveness, like she was the one being unfairly persecuted in this conversation. What do you want me to do, Sophia? Choose between my daughters. And there it was, the sentence that told me everything I needed to know. You already have, I said quietly. You've been choosing for 28 years. I just never had the nerve to say it out loud before now. That is not fair, my mother said, her voice rising, color coming into her cheeks. I have always loved you both equally. Then prove it, I said. Come to my wedding, all of it, not part of it, not squeezed in between Isabella's cocktail hour. My wedding, Mom, the one I've been planning for over a year, the one where I need my family in the front row. My mother was quiet for a long moment, and I watched her face cycle through something, guilt, maybe, or the memory of every small moment over the years where she'd chosen Isabella without a second thought, before she settled back into the same tired justification she'd been offering for weeks. Isabella needs us there for her big moment. She's more sensitive than you are, Sophia. She always has been. You've always been the strong one, the independent one. You don't need us the way she does. I remember standing in that kitchen, feeling something that was almost like relief mixed with the deepest grief I'd ever experienced. Because for the first time in my entire life, my mother had said the quiet part out loud. You've always been the strong one. Translation, you've always been the one whose pain we felt comfortable ignoring, because you never made us feel guilty enough to stop. Okay, I said, and my own calm surprised me. Then don't come. But understand that this is a choice, Mom. You're choosing Isabella's party over my wedding, and I need you to know that I see it clearly now, even if you've spent months pretending it was ever anything else. My father, who had been sitting silently at the kitchen table through this entire exchange, finally spoke. Sophia, don't be so dramatic. We'll figure something out. They never figured something out. 2 weeks before my wedding, I received a group text, not even a phone call, a group text, confirming that they would be attending Isabella's engagement party in full and would try to stop by my wedding reception if timing allowed. Timing never allowed, we all knew it wouldn't. June 14th arrived with a sky so clear and blue it almost felt like a cruel joke. The kind of perfect wedding whether you dream about for over a year, wasted on a day I already knew would carry a wound alongside its joy. I remember standing in the bridal suite of the Vineyard Barn that morning, watching the hairstylist twist soft curls into place, watching Margaret, Alexander's mother, not mine, fuss over my veil with tears already gathering in her eyes. "You look like an absolute vision," she told me, squeezing my hands. "David and I are so unbelievably proud to be part of this family with you." I held onto those words tightly because I needed something solid to hold onto that day. My phone had been silent since the morning. No good luck text from my mother, no calls from my father. Just silence, the loudest silence I've ever experienced, stretching out across a day that was supposed to be filled with love. Isabella texted me at 11 that morning. "Good luck today. So excited for my party tonight, can't wait to celebrate us both today in our own ways." I stared at that message for a long time before setting the phone face down and letting my bridesmaids finish getting me ready. The ceremony itself was, in the moments before it began, one of the most beautiful things I had ever seen. The vineyard bathed in golden late afternoon light, string lights already glowing faintly overhead in anticipation of dusk. 75 guests seated in white wooden chairs facing an arch wrapped in white roses and eucalyptus. But when I stood at the back of the aisle, my arm looped through my father's because he had, at minimum, agreed to walk me down before leaving early. I looked ahead at the family section reserved in the front row. 6 empty chairs. My mother's seat. My father's seat, which he would occupy for exactly the ceremony before disappearing. Isabella's seat. 3 more seats meant for extended family who had, unsurprisingly, followed the golden child's gravitational pull to her party instead. Can you imagine that walk? The music swelling, every eye on you, radiant in the most beautiful dress you've ever worn, and directly ahead, an entire row of empty chairs where your family should have been sitting, beaming with pride. I felt my father's arm tense beneath mine as we began to walk, and I wondered, distantly, if he felt even a flicker of the wrongness of this moment, or if he was simply counting the minutes until he could leave. I remember, in the seconds before the doors opened, standing in the barn's small anteroom and catching my own reflection in a full-length mirror propped against the wall, the ivory lace, the veil catching the light, the bouquet of garden roses trembling faintly in my hands because I couldn't quite stop them from shaking. I looked, I thought, exactly like the version of myself I'd dreamed about since I was a little girl paging through bridal magazines at Grandma Eleanor's kitchen table. And yet the day felt cracked straight down the middle, joy and grief tangled so tightly together I couldn't always tell where one ended and the other began. I didn't cry during the ceremony. I want you to know that. I looked past those empty chairs and found Alexander's face instead, waiting for me at the altar with an expression of such open, undisguised love and pride that it filled the hollow space those chairs had carved into my chest. I found Margaret and David in the second row, both crying, both radiant with joy for me. I found my bridesmaids, including, strangely, Isabella, who had shown up for the ceremony itself, dressed in her bridesmaid gown, before presumably leaving to change for her own party later that evening. My father walked me down the aisle, gave me away with a stiff, formal handshake to Alexander that felt more like a business transaction than a father's blessing, and left before the reception began. I watched him check his watch twice during the vows. The vows themselves, though, those I remember with total clarity because Alexander in his looked directly at me and said, "Sophia, I promise to be the family that shows up. Every single time, without exception, for the rest of our lives." I understood in that moment that he knew exactly what this day had cost me and that he was making me a promise no one else in my life had ever fully kept. My mother never came at all, not to the ceremony, not to any part of the reception. She sent instead a bouquet of flowers delivered to the venue with a card that read, "So sorry we couldn't make it work today. Congratulations, sweetheart, love, Mom and Dad." I read that card standing near the gift table during cocktail hour, and I felt something inside me go very, very still and very, very clear. What I didn't know, what none of us knew, except perhaps my grandmother Eleanor, wherever she was watching from, was that a plan she had set in motion nearly 3 years before her death was about to unfold in front of everyone that very evening. Grandma Eleanor had passed away 18 months before my wedding, from a sudden but peaceful heart condition at the age of 86. She had left behind an estate that, while not enormous by extravagant standards, was substantial, the accumulation of a lifetime of careful investing, real estate holdings, and a fierce, disciplined refusal to waste money on anything she considered frivolous. Her will had established a family trust, administered by her longtime attorney, a meticulous, silver-haired man named Mr. Whitfield, who had worked with her for over 30 years and who understood her wishes with an intimacy that bordered on friendship. What none of us fully understood, at the time the will was read shortly after her death, was a specific clause buried within the trust documents. A clause my grandmother had insisted upon with unusual, almost stubborn precision, one that Mr. Whitfield had questioned at the time, but ultimately drafted exactly as she'd requested. The trust stipulated that the bulk of Eleanor's estate, a sum that would eventually total just over $2 million, including a beautiful lake house property she'd owned for decades, would be held in trust for a period of 18 months following her death, contingent on a final observation period. During this period, the trustee, Mr. Whitfield, was instructed to observe the family's treatment of the granddaughter Eleanor identified, prior to her passing, as consistently overlooked and undervalued within the family structure. A phrase that, when Mr. Whitfield first read it aloud to me privately months later, made me press my hand over my mouth and cry harder than I had in years. Grandma Eleanor's exact language, according to the trust documents, was this: should the family, within the 18 months following my death, demonstrate through clear and documented action that they continue to prioritize one grandchild's needs and milestones over another's in matters of significant life events, including but not limited to weddings, graduations, or comparable milestones, I direct my trustee to transfer the entirety of the family trust, excluding modest individual bequests already specified, directly and irrevocably to my granddaughter Sophia, in recognition of a lifetime of being overlooked, and as recognition that fairness delayed does not mean fairness denied. She had built quietly and deliberately a legal safeguard around me, not out of vengeance toward Isabella or my parents, but out of a clear-eyed, unsentimental understanding, gathered across decades of watching our family dynamic play out, that if left to their own devices, my parents would eventually make a choice so blatant, so undeniable, that it would need no interpretation at all. She had, in essence, written a contingency plan for my own family's predictable behavior. And on June 14th, they fulfilled every condition of that contingency with startling, almost eerie precision. Mr. Whitfield, I would later learn, had been quietly monitoring the situation for months, aware of the wedding date conflict through occasional updates from Isabella herself, who had mentioned the engagement party planning to him during an unrelated conversation about a small trust distribution she'd already received. He hadn't intervened. The trust's language was explicit that the family had to act entirely on their own, without any outside influence. But he had apparently quietly attended my wedding that evening as an unannounced guest, seated toward the back, watching. He told me later that watching the ceremony unfold from the back row, watching me walk down that aisle toward an empty family section while my father checked his watch, had been one of the more difficult things he'd witnessed in his long career, made harder still by the knowledge of exactly what he carried in his briefcase that evening, and the professional obligation that kept him silently seated until the appropriate moment arrived. He approached me during the reception, introducing himself formally, and asked if he might have a private word with me and Alexander before the evening ended. We stepped into a small side room off the main reception hall, a quiet space usually used for bridal touch-ups, still warm with the golden light filtering through the windows as the sun began to set over the vineyard outside. "Sophia," Mr. Whitfield said, settling into a chair across from where Alexander and I sat, hands clasped together, "I want to first say congratulations, and I apologize for interrupting such an important day with matters of business. But your grandmother was very specific about the timing of this conversation, and I believe, having observed today's events, that the conditions of her trust have now been definitively met." He explained everything to us then: the clause, the 18-month observation window, the precise language my grandmother had insisted on. I sat there in my wedding dress, veil still pinned into my hair, feeling the full weight of my grandmother's foresight settle over me like something between a blessing and a ghost. She knew, I whispered, more to myself than to him. She actually knew this would happen. Your grandmother, Mr. Whitfield said, with something like fondness in his voice, was one of the most perceptive people I've ever had the privilege of working with. She told me, quite plainly, during our final meeting to draft this clause, that she'd watched your family for 30 years, and that she had no illusions about how this would eventually play out if left unaddressed. She said, and I remember this quite specifically because it struck me as unusually direct even for her, they will show her, eventually, in some grand and undeniable way, exactly where they've ranked her all along. And when they do, I want there to be consequences that finally make them see her the way I always have. I cried then, finally and completely, not from the grief of the empty chairs earlier that day, but from something that felt closer to being profoundly, retroactively seen by a woman who had passed away over a year before but who had, in her own careful, methodical way, made sure I would never again have to wonder if my worth had been noticed. Mr. Whitfield explained the mechanics of the transfer to us calmly, professionally, walking through documentation, tax considerations, and the timeline for finalizing the trust distribution over the following weeks. The lake house, the investment portfolio, the full weight of my grandmother's estate, all of it would transfer to me entirely and irrevocably within 30 days. There is one more thing, Mr. Whitfield added, his expression turning slightly more careful. Your grandmother's trust also included a provision that upon transfer, any joint accounts or supplementary financial support your grandmother had been quietly providing to your parents, a monthly stipend she'd established years ago to help supplement their retirement savings, which I believe they've come to rely upon rather significantly, would cease immediately upon the trust's finalization, redirected instead into the primary trust now transferring to you. Your grandmother was, shall we say, thorough. I hadn't even known that stipend existed. I would learn in the weeks that followed just how significantly my parents had come to depend on it. While I was standing in that quiet side room, absorbing news that would alter the entire trajectory of my life, an entirely different scene was unfolding 40 minutes away at the Baymont Terrace, where Isabella's engagement party was reaching what should have been its triumphant crescendo. I only learned the full details of what happened there secondhand, pieced together over the following days from Isabella herself, from my mother, and eventually from a cousin who'd been in attendance and clearly couldn't resist sharing the story. The party, by all accounts, had been extravagant, a rooftop venue overlooking the harbor, a live band, an open bar that had been running for nearly 3 hours, and a catering bill that, I'd later learn, ran well into 5 figures. My parents had insisted on paying for the majority of it themselves, eager to give Isabella the celebration they felt she deserved. Near the end of the evening, as the final course was being cleared and the venue coordinator approached my father with the finalized bill for the open bar extension Isabella had requested midway through the party, my father's card was declined. Declined in front of nearly 100 guests, at the exact moment the coordinator had discreetly approached the head table to settle the remaining balance. My father, confused and increasingly flustered, tried a second card. Also declined. He stepped away to call the bank, his face reportedly draining of color as he listened to an automated message explaining that a recurring transfer he'd relied upon for years had failed to process that month, triggering a cascade of low balance alerts and declined transactions across multiple linked accounts. What he didn't yet know, what none of them yet knew, was that the monthly stipend my grandmother had quietly been providing them for years, the one that had comfortably padded their retirement accounts, and apparently funded rather more generous spending than their actual salaries alone would have allowed, had been formally terminated that very afternoon, the moment Mr. Whitfield confirmed the trust conditions had been met. My mother, according to my cousin, grew increasingly panicked as the reality of the situation set in: an unpaid bill, a room full of guests, and no immediately available funds to cover the difference. Isabella, mortified, reportedly began crying in the venue's private lounge, convinced the entire party had been ruined by what she assumed was simply an embarrassing banking error. It was my mother who first put the pieces together, or at least began to suspect them. She would later tell me that she'd had a sudden sinking realization standing in that rooftop lounge, staring at her declined card, remembering, with the particular clarity that only crisis seems to provide, a conversation from over a year earlier where my grandmother's attorney had mentioned, almost in passing, something about a trust review tied to family conduct that my mother had dismissed at the time as irrelevant legal formality. She excused herself from the party, stepped into a quiet stairwell, and called me. I was still in that small side room with Alexander and Mr. Whitfield when my phone rang, my mother's name lighting up the screen for the first time all day. I looked at Alexander, he nodded quietly, and I answered. Sophia. My mother's voice was tight, higher than usual, carrying an edge of panic I had genuinely never heard from her before, not once in 28 years. Something's wrong with our accounts. Your father's cards are all declining. We're at Isabella's party and we can't cover the final bill, and I don't understand what's happening. Do you know anything about this? I want to be honest with you about the moment that followed, because I think it says something important about who I'd become by that point in the day. I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindictive. What I felt more than anything was a strange, settled calm, the calm of someone who has spent an entire lifetime waiting for the universe to finally balance a scale that had been tilted against her for as long as she could remember. I actually do know something about it, Mom, I said, my voice steady in a way that surprised even me. Grandma Eleanor set up a specific condition in her trust. It required an 18-month observation period to see whether the family would continue prioritizing Isabella over me in major life events. Today was the deadline, and you chose Isabella's engagement party over my wedding in the most public, undeniable way possible. So the trust has now transferred to me in full, including the stipend she'd been quietly providing you and Dad for years, which has also now been redirected. The silence on the other end of the line stretched out so long I thought the call had dropped. That can't be real, my mother finally said, her voice small in a way I had genuinely never heard before. Sophia, please, there has to be some kind of mistake. We can talk to the lawyer, we can explain. There's nothing to explain, Mom. You had 18 months to show that you didn't consistently choose Isabella over me. You had over a year of specific warning about the wedding date conflict, and month after month of me begging you to prioritize even a fraction of my wedding day. And today, you chose her party, all of you, in front of everyone. We can fix this, my mother said, her voice cracking now, panic bleeding through the careful control she'd maintained for years. Sophia, please, we need that money, your father's retirement, the house. I have documentation of every conversation, Mom, I said quietly. Every text where you dismissed my wedding date conflict. Every call where you told me I was being dramatic. Mr. Whitfield has been aware of the situation for months, and he confirmed tonight in person that the conditions were unmistakably met. This isn't a mistake. This is exactly what you and Dad and Isabella chose over and over again for years. I could hear, faintly in the background, Isabella's voice rising in panic, my father's low, urgent tone trying to calm the situation with the venue coordinator, the muffled chaos of a party crumbling in real time. Please, my mother said again, and I heard for the first time in my entire life something that sounded almost like genuine fear in her voice, not fear for me, I understood even then, but fear of consequence finally, unavoidably arriving at her own door. Sophia, we're your family, please don't do this to us. I didn't do this, I said, and I meant it completely. Grandma Eleanor did this because she saw exactly who you all were years before tonight ever happened. All I did was get married today, surrounded by an empty row of chairs where my family should have been sitting. I hung up the phone after that. I remember setting it down on the small table beside me, taking a slow breath and looking up at Alexander, who reached over and took my hand without saying a word, his eyes full of a quiet, steady pride that told me, more clearly than anything else could have, that I had done exactly the right thing. The days that followed unfolded with a strange, almost clinical efficiency, as Mr. Whitfield guided me through the formal transfer of the trust. There were documents to sign, accounts to establish. A meeting with a financial advisor Alexander insisted we bring in immediately so I wouldn't have to navigate any of it alone. My parents called repeatedly in the days after the wedding, sometimes apologetic, sometimes pleading, occasionally, in a few uglier moments, accusatory, suggesting I had somehow manipulated my grandmother into writing the clause, an accusation so absurd given the timeline that I didn't even bother dignifying it with much of a response. Isabella texted me 3 days after the wedding. I can't believe you'd do this to your own family over one party. Grandma clearly favored you and this whole thing feels insane. Mom and Dad are devastated. I sat with that message for a long time before responding because I wanted my response to be measured, not reactive. Eventually, I wrote back. I didn't write the trust Izzy. Grandma did, based on years of watching how this family treated me. I begged for months for you to move one party by even a week, and none of you would. I'm not choosing to hurt anyone. I'm simply living with the consequences you all chose for yourselves. She never responded to that message. My father called once, about 2 weeks after the wedding, in what I understood, even as it happened, was an attempt to appeal to whatever daughterly guilt he assumed I still carried. Sophia, your mother hasn't been sleeping. This has been incredibly hard on her, on all of us. I know you're upset, but is there really no room for some kind of compromise here? Dad, I said, I asked for one thing, one single thing in 28 years. I asked you to show up for my wedding completely, the way you always showed up completely for Isabella's milestones. You couldn't do that. I'm not interested in compromising on the consequences of a choice I begged all of you repeatedly not to make. He didn't have a response to that. I don't think in his heart he'd ever expected me to actually hold a boundary. I think, if I'm honest, that's exactly why they'd felt so comfortable overlooking me for so many years, because I'd never once in 28 years made them face a real consequence for it. I made the decision, in the weeks that followed, to significantly limit contact with my parents and Isabella. I didn't cut them off with dramatic finality, and I want to be clear about that, because I think there's an important distinction between righteous boundary setting and simple cruelty. I still, to this day, send a card on my parents' birthdays. I still occasionally respond to a text if one of them reaches out with something that isn't laced with guilt or manipulation. But I stopped attending family gatherings that centered Isabella. I stopped answering calls that came only when they wanted something. I redirected the emotional energy I used to pour into begging for scraps of attention into building a life with Alexander and his family. The family that had shown me, from the very beginning, exactly what unconditional love was supposed to look like. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from finally getting justice you spent your whole life believing you didn't deserve to ask for. I want to be honest with you about that complexity, because I think stories like this one sometimes get flattened into pure triumph, when the truth is messier and more human than that. I grieved, in the months following my wedding, for the family I'd always wished I had rather than the one I actually did. I grieved for the version of my mother who, in some alternate timeline, might have chosen my wedding without a second thought, simply because it was mine. I grieved, honestly, for Isabella too, not for the sister who'd so casually scheduled her party over my wedding, but for the little girl she'd once been, who genuinely hadn't asked to be the sun our family orbited around, even if she'd grown quite comfortable staying there. But alongside that grief, something steadier and more powerful took root, a sense of my own worth that no longer depended on my family's ability or willingness to recognize it. Alexander and I settled into married life with a kind of grounded happiness I genuinely never believed I deserved. We used part of the trust, eventually, to purchase a home of our own, modest, warm, full of the kind of light I'd always imagined for myself as a kid, lying awake in a house where I so often felt invisible. Margaret and David treated the news of the inheritance not with envy or awkwardness, but with the same warm pride they'd shown me from the very beginning. Your grandmother sounds like she was an extraordinary woman, Margaret told me once, holding my hand across her kitchen table. She saw you, Sophia, really saw you. That's a gift, even wrapped in grief. I think about my grandmother often, about the quiet, methodical love embedded in that trust, built not out of anger toward my parents or Isabella, but out of a fierce, unwavering commitment to making sure I would never again have to wonder if my worth had gone unnoticed. She didn't write that clause to punish my family. She wrote it because she understood, with the clarity that only distance and decades of observation can provide, that some people only learn to see clearly when the cost of their blindness finally becomes impossible to ignore. My parents did eventually reach out again, about 8 months after the wedding, in a more measured, less demanding way than their initial panicked calls. My mother sent a long letter, an actual letter, handwritten, which surprised me given how little handwriting I'd ever seen from her, acknowledging, in halting, imperfect language, that she'd spent my entire childhood assuming my quiet strength meant I needed less from her, when really, she wrote, it had probably meant I needed just as much, if not more, simply expressed in ways she hadn't known how to recognize. I don't know if that letter represents real change or simply the softened language of consequence finally landing. Maybe it's both. I've chosen to leave the door open a small crack, not because I owe them unconditional access to my life again, but because I've learned that boundaries and complete severance aren't always the same thing, and I get to decide, on my own terms, how much space I make for people who are still learning how to show up. I think a lot, too, about what it means to inherit something you never asked for, not just the money, though I won't pretend that hasn't changed my life in very real, practical ways, but the deeper inheritance my grandmother left me. The understanding that being seen clearly by even one person can be enough to anchor you through years of being overlooked by everyone else. I used part of the lake house in the first summer after it became mine to host a small gathering for Alexander's family, Margaret and David, a handful of cousins, close friends who'd stood by me through the hardest year of my life. I stood on that dock at sunset, watching people I loved laugh together over a meal I'd cooked myself, and I felt, for the first time in my entire adult life, like I was standing at the center of my own story instead of the edges of someone else's. I've also had to sit with harder questions in the months since, questions about forgiveness, about what I owe people who raised me imperfectly, about whether justice and reconciliation can ever fully coexist. I don't have neat answers to any of that, and I'm suspicious of anyone who claims they do. What I know is this: I no longer measure my worth by how loudly my family celebrates me. I no longer walk into a room bracing myself to be overlooked. Some days that shift feels hard-won and fragile, like a muscle I'm still learning to trust. Other days it feels as solid and unshakable as the ground beneath my feet. Growth, I've learned, rarely arrives in one clean, permanent motion. It arrives in layers, the way trust rebuilds slowly after betrayal, the way confidence grows quietly after years of doubt. What I hold on to most, in the quiet moments when old wounds occasionally resurface, is the image of my grandmother at that kitchen table, pouring tea, asking me what was really on my mind. She gave me the gift of being witnessed long before she ever gave me the gift of that trust, and I've come to understand that the second was simply an extension of the first, her final, most emphatic way of saying, "I see you, Sophia. I have always seen you. Now let the whole world see you too." Isabella and I speak occasionally now, carefully, in the tentative way of two people rebuilding something from wreckage neither of us fully caused alone. She's never fully acknowledged her role in scheduling that party, not directly. But there's been a shift in how she talks to me, less performative, more searching, like she's beginning slowly to understand what it might have felt like to grow up in someone else's shadow, even if she was the one casting it. If there's one thing I want you to take from my story, it's this: being overlooked by the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally is a wound, but it doesn't have to be a life sentence. You don't have to keep begging for a seat at a table that was never truly set for you. Sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop asking and start building a table of your own, surrounded by people who show up for you completely, every single time, without exception. My grandmother used to tell me that being overlooked isn't the same as being unworthy. It took me 28 years, an empty row of chairs at my own wedding, and one extraordinary act of foresight from a woman who saw me clearly when almost no one else did, to finally understand what she meant. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever felt like the overlooked one in your own family, the one who came second, the one who kept showing up anyway, I want you to know that your worth was never actually in question. It was simply waiting for the right people, and sometimes the right moment to finally, undeniably be seen. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more real-life tales of family drama, betrayal, and the quiet, satisfying justice that comes when the truth finally catches up with the people who tried to outrun it. Drop a comment below and tell me, have you ever had a moment where the people who overlooked you finally had to face the consequences? I want to hear your story. And if you know someone who needs to hear this message today, share this video with them. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next story.